Hello guys, as promised, this week I'll be going over how I constructed my nut shooter, the P50 Mark II. The build process spanned several weekends, although that doesn't include the time spent planning and sketching designs. If you don't have a CNC, you can still make this slingshot, you'll just need a steady hand and a healthy amount of patience. So, to get started, here's what you'll need. Plywood, sold as 1/4 inch sheets, but in reality more like 0.2 inches or 5 millimeters thick. Glue, Elmer's or wood, either will work. Crazy glue or cyanoacrylate is also useful to keep on hand to quickly set smaller pieces. Fasteners. I mostly use number 6 machine screws, which are somewhere between M3 and M4 in size. Some of the screws that would see heavier loading were upgraded to size 8. Also load up on flat washers, split washers, and nuts. A 1-inch board, which really means any wood with a thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Paracord, which has a nominal thickness of 3/16 of an inch under tension. Magnets. I bought some disc-shaped neodymium magnets online. They were 1/4 of an inch in diameter and 1/16 of an inch thick. Number 6 or 8 threaded rod. There's one feature on the P50 that's too wide for number 6 bolts. If you don't want to resort to using wood screws, you'll need to grab one of these. Home Depot should have lengths of threaded rod for a couple dollars a piece. On to fabrication. Step 1. Cutting. Actually, before that, you should be familiar with the parts of the P50, so Step 0, background. This is the naming convention I chose for the parts and their file names. Making up the core layer of the P50, we have the grip, the trigger, the catch, the slide, the loader, the upper barrel, the lower barrel, and the magazine base plate. These pieces are all denoted with an L0 prefix in their file names. If you have plywood that measures 0.2 inches thick, you'll need to stack 3 layers of plywood to accommodate the thickness of a 1/2 inch nut. If you're using material like MDF that actually does come in 1/4 inch thicknesses, you'll only need 2 layers. One layer out from the core, we have the primary frame, which almost everything will attach to. You'll need 2 of these. The file name for this piece starts with L1. One more layer out, we have the pump guide rails, the accessory bracket, and the bolt handle. These are the L2 files if you couldn't guess. The front forks are considered an L0 item. The pump components are labeled with a leading P. The stock and its reinforcing members are considered optional and will be prefixed with S. I'm currently in the process of redesigning the stock to be stronger as well as adjustable, so I'll present that in a later video. The sighting system is left entirely up to you. Make sure you have fasteners long enough to span at least 5 layers of plywood, 2 washers, and a nut. Okay, now we can cut these things out. You can print out the template and do it all by hand, or go the CNC route, which is how I did it for the smaller parts. The SVGs are included with the project files, and keep in mind that they were processed in Inkscape, so the resolution is 90 ppi if you want to open them in MakerCam. If you take the CNC route, do not make the same mistake I did. Be sure to make use of tabs, which will prevent milled pieces from separating prematurely from the stock material. Click on the video annotation in the corner for a quick tutorial on how to set this up in MakerCam. Other than using tabs, I would recommend including a 1/4 inch diameter circle in your SVG so that when you arrange different pieces to be cut, you can quickly tell if there's enough room between components for the cutter to move through. On to Step 2, secondary machining operations. Once you have all of the pieces cut out, they need to be prepared. For the CNC cut parts, all you have to do is a little bit of sanding. The larger pieces like the L1 frame will no doubt come out a little bit uneven unless you have steadier hands and better tools than I do. Actually, that's a very real possibility, but for the sake of this video, let's assume that you're in the same boat I am. Depending on just how poorly your use of the saw was, you can potentially straighten everything out with just some diligent sanding, or you could mount everything on your CNC and use manual controls to trim everything down to a laser straight finish, and you can do the same thing for the slots. Since I don't trust myself to drill vertical holes, I also took the time to use my CNC as a drill press. Using the jog functions, you can very easily and accurately drill a 2-inch repeating hole pattern. Later, I enlarged the holes to 5/16 of an inch for my fasteners. Step 3. Lamination. Now it's time to glue together everything we know will stay together. All of the L0 pieces should be stuck together first. Compress the pieces as they dry, especially the longer ones like the barrel and magazine-related components. This will lock them into laying flat. Next, making sure you have enough room for a hex nut to pass between them, glue the barrel and magazine strips to one of the L1 frames. The grip should also be installed at this time. Once those pieces are firmly adhered to each other, you'll also want to mate the L2 guide rails to the L1 frames. Same deal with these, make sure everything is straight when you clamp them to dry. Step 4. Adjustment. Once everything's set, you'll want to go over all the parts one more time with sandpaper just to smooth out any of the dried glue and small misalignments. You'll also want to sand down one of the faces of the L0 components that'll be moving, like the trigger and loader. Even 1/16 of an inch should be plenty. Try pinning some of your parts in place using your fasteners. You may need to re-drill some of the holes if the alignment isn't perfect, or tweak some of the parts in the receiver so that they fit better. Now is also a good time to install the magnets. I put one attracting pair between the trigger and the catch to link their motion. I put a repulsive pair between the trigger and the grip in order to reset the trigger between shots. I put a repulsive pair between the slide and the loader so that it would always be ready to chamber around. And I put a lone magnet in the barrel to hold a hex nut in place before firing. You may need to install spacers or sand down some components if you're not getting the desired range of motion. By the way, make sure you put some heavy curvature into the catch. This is the biggest source of wear on the paracord, and the better you round it, the longer you can go without servicing the slingshot. Before you close up the slingshot, you'll also want to smooth out any surface that'll be in contact with paracord. I would suggest using a 220 grit or higher sandpaper. Step 5. The pump. Although you could technically machine this in 3 or even 2 components, it's still faster to build it in layers. Laminate everything like we did before and fit check it with the body of the P50. I would use a combination of wood screws and glue to mate the sides of the pump to the base piece. Round the faces that'll be in contact with the paracord and trim off excess material as desired, making sure the pump can still actuate the bolt handle. Although I originally installed a foregrip on the P50, I found that it caused increased friction on the pump guide rails. Plus, it was too far forward to practically improve the handling characteristics of the weapon. Step 6. The front fork. Mount the fork interface blocks to the frame of the P50 before attaching them to the forks. You'll want compressive forces to help fix everything in place so that the bolt holes are taking as little load as possible. You'll need to carve out a small amount of clearance on the pump guide rails for the fasteners unless you widen the interface blocks and attachment points, which I was too lazy to do. Once the interface blocks are securely attached, you can bolt on the fork. Step 7. Miscellaneous parts. The magazine plug was improvised, but I like this design because the rubber bands are able to absorb a lot of the shock. If you have a bunch of heavy nuts sliding around in the magazine, rigid ammo retention mechanisms can be damaged over time. The cocking lever can take whatever shape you want. The only requirement is that it must be securely attached without the screws being fully tightened, otherwise the slide won't have a smooth action. I recommend threading directly into the cocking lever instead of using a nut to captivate everything. You'll want to bolt a block to the bottom of the accessory bracket to limit the range of motion of the feeder, and also glue in a physical stop for the pump mechanism. You can either keep the integrated front sight on the fork or glue in your own. My rear sight is slightly taller than the front sight to help account for nut drop. You can make adjustments to the alignment of the sights by adding in spacers between the rear sight and the accessory bracket. Step 8. Fastening strategy. Alright, I want to clear the air about some of the decisions I made in assembling the P50. Yes, I am technically using split washers incorrectly. They should be placed directly between a bolt or a nut and the substrate so that they can bite into the material and resist loosening. But I'm always trying to avoid damaging the frame, so all I'm looking for is a little bit of pretension on the threads. I'm also too cheap to buy thumb screws, so instead I threaded a couple nuts all the way up my machine screws to provide some purchase for my fingertips when tightening or loosening things by hand. And also, yes, wood glue would be a better choice than Elmer's. It bonds more rigidly and holds up better over time, but I keep forgetting to pick some up at Home Depot. Still, white glue gives me about 80% of the capabilities for zero investment or thinking. If you're so inclined to build something like this, I hope I've provided enough information to help get you started. If you do build your own nut shooter, I encourage you to share any pictures, tips, or modifications you might have made on the Shapeoko or Slingshot forum posts for this project. For those of you that have made it all the way to the end, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll be back in a week or two with another project.